பொழுது ராமானுஜம் ஐயா அவர்கள் இந்த ஒரு நூலை வெளியிடுவதற்கான வாய்ப்பை வழங்கினார். இந்த நூலை எழுதியிருக்கக்கூடிய சுந்தர் சர்க்கை அவர்களை உங்கள் எல்லோருக்கும் தெரிந்திருக்கும் என்று நினைக்கின்றேன். ராமானுஜம் ஐயா அவர்களை உங்கள் எல்லோருக்கும் நன்றாகவே தெரிந்திருக்கும். சுந்தர் சர்க்கை அவர்கள் பற்றி சொல்ல வேண்டுமானால், அவர் இங்கே இந்தியாவில் இருக்கக்கூடிய மிக முக்கியமான சமகால தத்துவ அறிஞர்களில் ஒருவர். அவர் இயற்கை குறித்தும், இயற்கை தத்துவம் குறித்தும், சமூக அறிவியல் தத்துவங்கள் குறித்தும் இயற்கை குறித்தும் சமூக அறிவியல் தத்துவம் குறித்தும் தொடர்ச்சியாக எழுதி வருகின்றவர்கள், ஆராய்ச்சி மேற்கொண்டு வருகின்றவர், எழுதி வருகின்றவர். குறிப்பாக அவருடைய ஃபேர்புக் பிலாசபர்ஸ் என்கிற ஒரு இணையதளத்தை நீங்கள் எல்லோரும் பார்த்திருப்பீர்கள் என்று நினைக்கின்றேன். எனக்கு அந்த பெயரை கேள்விப்பட்டவுடன் ஃபேர்புக் டாக்டர்ஸ் என்ற ஒரு வார்த்தை தான் எனக்கு தெரிந்த, அதற்கு முன்பு தெரிந்த ஒரு வாசகம். அந்த வார்த்தையை பற்றியும் அது பற்றிய விளக்கங்களையும் அந்த தளத்தில் படித்துப்பார்கள். இந்த தத்துவம் என்பது ஏதோ ஒரு சிலருடைய, ஒரு அறிவார்ந்தவர்கள் அல்லது அகடமிக்ஸோட வெகு சிலருடைய பேச்சாக மட்டும் இருக்க வேண்டியதில்லை. அது அந்த புத்தகங்களில் இருந்து மட்டும் பேச வேண்டியதில்லை, மரபுகளில் இருந்து மட்டும் பேச வேண்டிய அவசியம் இல்லை. சாதாரண வாழ்க்கையில் ஈடுபடுகின்ற, எளிய வாழ்க்கையை வாழ்ந்து கொண்டிருக்கிற ஒரு மனிதர்கள் தங்களுடைய அனுபவங்களில் இருந்து தத்துவம் பற்றி பேசலாம், தத்துவார்த்தமாக சிந்திக்கலாம், தத்துவார்த்தமாக சிந்திக்க வேண்டும், தத்துவார்த்தமாக விமர்சிக்க வேண்டும் என்கிற நோக்கத்துடன் சுந்தர் சர்க்கை அவர்கள் தத்துவத்தை சாதாரண எளிய மக்களிடம் கொண்டு போய் சேர்க்க வேண்டும் என்று நினைக்கிற ஒரு தத்துவ அறிஞர். இதிலிருந்து அவர் எப்படிப்பட்ட ஒரு அறிஞர் என்பதை நீங்கள் எல்லோரும் புரிந்து கொள்ள முடியும் என்று நினைக்கிறேன். அதனால் அவர் எல்லா விதமான கேள்விகளையும் எதிர்கொள்ள விரும்புகின்றார். எல்லா விதமான கேள்விகளின் உடனான உரையாடல்களையும் அவர்கள் விரும்புகின்றார். அவர் இங்கு தமிழ்நாட்டில் இருந்து சென்றவர் என்பது இன்னும் ஒரு கூடுதலான சிறப்பான விஷயம் என்று நினைக்கிறேன். தமிழிலும் அவர் நன்றாக உரையாடுவார். இன்று தமிழில் உரையாடுவார், ஆங்கிலம் கலந்து தமிழில் உரையாடுவார் என்று உமேஷ் அவர்கள் என்னிடம் சொன்னார். இந்த உரையாடல் நிகழ்ச்சியை எப்படி அமைத்துக் கொள்ள இருக்கின்றோம் என்றால், முதற்கண் அவர்கள் இங்கே அவருடைய ஒரு உரை, அறிவியல் குறித்த ஒரு விமர்சன பார்வை என்கிற ஒரு உரையை, அந்த பொருளான உரையை வழங்குவார். அதற்கு பிறகு ஒரு உரையாடல் இருக்கும். அதற்கு பிறகு ஒரு நன்றி உரை இருக்கும். இதுதான் நம்முடைய திட்டம். அதனால் முதற்கண் அவரை இந்த பொருண்மை குறித்து பேசுமாறு அழைக்கின்றேன். அப்படியா? ரொம்ப நன்றி. கேட்கலையா? எப்போ ரொம்ப இல்ல. சோ நான் வேணா இப்படியே பேசலாமா? ஓகே, கொஞ்சம் லவுடா பேசுறேன். உங்களுக்கு காது கேட்கலன்னா சொல்லுங்க. வேணா அந்த விண்டோ வேணா மூடலாம். இது ஆஃப் பண்ணிட்டு பரவாயில்ல, நான் அப்படியே பேசுறேன். ஃபேன் மட்டும் ப்ராப்ளமா? கொஞ்சம் கத்தி பேசுறேன், பார்க்கலாம். வருதான். ரொம்ப எக்கோவா இருந்தது. ஃபேன் ஒண்ணா கொஞ்சம் கம்மி ஆகணும். ஃபேன் ஆஃப் பண்ணி பரவாயில்ல. ரொம்ப தேங்க்யூ வெரி மச். நான் வந்து இங்கிலீஷ்லயும் தமிழ்லையும் பேசலாம்னாங்க. ஸோ நான் முதல்ல இங்கிலீஷ்ல ஆரம்பிக்கிறேன். நீங்க ஏதாவது கொஸ்டின்ஸ் இருந்தா கேளுங்க. வி கேன் ஹேவ் அ கான்வர்சேஷன் பேஸ்ட் ஆன் திஸ். டாபிக் ரொம்ப ஹாட்டா இருக்குன்னு கொஞ்சம் பயந்துட்டு இருந்தேன். Because the topic itself, what is science? A lot of people have various response. And with the fans being off, it's really truly a hot room in which we will discuss this topic.
I'm very grateful to Seedmai and OS Ahmed for this publishing this translation of the book. And of course, to Ramanujam, who is one of the most wonderful author and translators that I know, who brings new life into the book. So I'm very glad to be part of this collaboration and to, bring this part. Let me say a little bit about that What is Science book. I actually wrote it, for National Book Trust. And this is something which I really wanted to do for the National Book Trust because, it has great readership. It is priced at, when it first came out, it was 100 rupees. And even now, as long as it is in print, it's just 120, 130. It has great, penetration into various places. So this is a book where I've had many people. Actually, I think this is the most read book of mine, which doesn't mean much. I don't think people read much of what we write, especially these academic books and so on. But it is a book which has had great experience, pleasure for me in terms of the kind of discussions and other stuff it has had. When we did the translation, so there's something very unique about this Tamil translation. I want to begin with that. The uniqueness in the Tamil translation is, one, of course, it is unique in that Ramanujam translated it so effortlessly. The second point was Ramanujam was going on, when we're discussing it, he was saying, look, where is the language for philosophy in Tamil? How do you engage with it? Professor Nirmal Sarvamani is with us. He's been writing about this very important topic, and there are some very important insights into what is philosophy, how do we understand philosophy in Tamil. But so when Ramanujam, we were talking about the vocabulary. So philosophy, if I talk about it as a subject, there are disciplines like, epistemology, which is what is knowledge, and ideas of truth and so on. So we were trying to see what are the Tamil equivalents. How do you write about this kind of contemporary philosophy in Tamil? That was part of a challenge. And so Ramanujam suggested that we could have a short summary of the basic concepts in philosophy. So actually, that is a very interesting part of this book for both of us, and I hope for the readers. The last about 50 pages are actually a summary, a glossary of key concepts in philosophy. What is ontology? What is epistemology? What is this? So that, it's a way of trying to understand what these terms actually mean. Now, the point was this. To me, as our friend mentioned in his introduction, to me, a very important part of philosophy is it is not about a separate subject. It is not about something which a few people will do. It is about life. It is about talking in this room with the traffic behind us. In a normal academic environment, we'll have a completely soundproof room. Even people are soundproofed inside. They're so isolated from the world, we sit and we talk to ourselves. And that becomes philosophy. But to me, in my work with philosophy for children, for example, all of it came as I was trying to struggle with, why are we doing philosophy? What does it mean? So today, more than science, I want to talk about and share with you, and I want to listen to what all of you, I'm sure, have very deep ideas about what is science, what is philosophy. So I want to see how we can together think about this problem of what is science by using the excuse of philosophy. So philosophy is a way of thinking about the world. That's the first starting point I want to begin with. And it is a way of understanding something. And the word understanding is very interesting. It's a very important term in today's world. In social science, and I'm sure most of us are from social science, humanities, literature, understanding is a key concept. Because if you ask the question, understanding, puriyardu is one possible translation. Puriyardu, so puriyardu, understand, that kind of is a kind of an understanding. But what is it to understand? See, I always work as a teacher to students. So when I speak to students, I'm always anticipating the student is going to ask me, I don't understand what you say. So I begin with that. So that's why I do, and I love doing this philosophy for children, because children don't have the hesitancy. They don't feel ashamed or feel hesitant. If I tell them I use a word understanding, then immediately somebody will get up, sir, understanding na enna sir, puriyala. So we have to ask the question, understanding na enna? What does it actually, what should I do? When do I know I have understood something? Okay, so social science, the idea of understanding is very important. because of various reasons. I'll talk about it in the end. But the point is, a lot of our philosophy that we do is to understand the world. What does it mean to understand the world? Understand human beings, understand human relations, understand the society. Why is the society the way it is? How do I make sense of the world? Why do people behave the way they do? Now, remember, therefore, we begin with a very basic point that the only discipline in the world, the starting discipline, the mother discipline of all disciplines is philosophy. Because philosophy is about understanding. Science is also about understanding. Arts is about understanding. Literature is about understanding. All of them break away from philosophy. They very literally, they become children of philosophy. And that going away, when the children become adults and they leave the mother and go away, that is the tension between disciplines. But the same genetic makeup, if you like, it's not a term I really like to use because it's got so many other problems when you talk about that. But that idea, the genetic makeup of philosophy is present in all the disciplines. So I want to begin with a simple question. I want to understand this thing called science. Why should I want to understand it? I want to understand it because we live in a scientific society. Today, it is impossible for you to understand our society without understanding science and technology. Technology has become the de facto face of science. It's a hidden face of science. We don't think we are doing science when we use technology. Today, India is one of the biggest markets for smartphones, for mobile phones. In every house, there is a scientific world which is present. It is present before us. And if you don't understand science, you won't understand these technologies. Technologies are not innocent dolls inside the house. Every phone like this, particularly of these phones, they are like this Google, Alexa, those machines which have come. And today, many of those machines, they can listen to everything which is going on in the house. They know what you are reading. Today, everybody wants to know what you are reading, what you are thinking, what you are speaking to your friends. Everything is known. Why? Because there is somebody inside the house listening to you all the time. It's really remarkable. I don't use a smartphone, I use this button phone. But I'll tell you, even with that button phone, what one of my nieces said, oh, you're using this phone, it's called button phone. I didn't even know it was called button phone. Something very interesting. One day I was speaking on that phone. I was talking to my friend about something and he said he wanted a lawyer. And I was talking about it and I'm not exaggerating. Next day I get an SMS. Are you looking for a lawyer? Smartphone is much deeper. They know everything about you. Forget it. You are not an individual in the world of smartphone. I'm talking even of that button phone. There are systems which can track everything that we do. So don't we want to understand the society we are living in? Don't we want to understand how using vehicles like motorbikes and cars has changed the body structure? Today we walk and our body posture is different. We have biologically changed. It has changed the way we think about the world. It has changed the way we talk to each other. Don't we want to understand that? Understanding is it's one of the most human aspects of wanting to know, what is this? If I see a new object in front of me, I want to know, what is this? So how do we understand science? That is the point. That's a simple point I'm starting on. It is not my question. People have been doing this for 100 years, at least 100 years. In fact, the greatest scientists, starting with your early, whether it's Galileo, Newton, what we call as modern science, right up to Einstein, they all wanted this question. They were not doing science. They also wanted to understand what science is. So understanding science is something which many of us are interested in. Just like I want to understand society, I want to understand another person. How do I do it? And who can do it? Who has the capacity to understand science? That is the question. Can anybody understand science? Typically look at what happens. If you are, I'm sure many of you have many science friends. If you're already not doing science, I have done in these workshops with children, I can tell you, small kids of 10 years, 5th standard, 6th standard students, when they talk about science, they will tell their friends, oh, you don't understand this. They'll suddenly say, neuron, they have read something. Oh, brain is working, neurons, synapses, or DNA and genes. And they feel that others don't understand it. There is already something very special about this idea of science and the idea of scientific knowledge. Look at, if you go try and talk to a scientist, typically what they'll say, yeah, it's very difficult subject, but don't worry, I'll try and explain it to you, but you may not be able to understand all of it. Today, we have, particularly in India, a very large number of students drop out of science. Our dropping rate in schools is largely because of mathematics and science. That's why our gross enrollment ratio is so low. If you look at number of students who do humanities like literature, you ask them why, they say, I couldn't do science, I can't do mathematics. I'm sure you're seeing this all around you. In India today, more than 50% of our students don't do science. They do arts, whatever else it is, as long as it is not science. You talk to students in 11th, they'll say, I will do anything as long as it doesn't have mathematics or physics or whatever. It has an effect on society. How you understand science impacts our children right from our early age. And look at the state's relationship with science. So it's not just about a question of knowledge. There is no science possible without the support of the state. The state and science always go hand in hand together, for a variety of reasons. In the first earliest model of the Industrial Revolution, capitalism is very closely aligned with scientific systems. It is industries, factories, mass production, which actually leads to establishment of a capitalist economy. Without the possibility of science producing this kind of knowledge, you cannot have, without capital, you cannot have capitalism as a system. And capitalism is a larger thing about the society, right? Look at society's relationship with along with these factories. A very important part of a social relationship is with what we call as the military industrial complex. In fact, some of the most important work, development in science comes because of war technologies. It is defense and war which has actually funded a very large amount of scientific money for scientific projects. Today, for example, if you look at the kind of funding which goes into science, between 35%, between 30 to 40, but let's say about 35% on average, 1/3 of money in science are all for war efforts, defense-related, military-related science. 1/3 of science. And another huge percentage of the thing, and this is a number which we can put different numbers to it, is in the hands of the private. Today, science is funded largely about 30 to 35% with defense, maybe 20% and maybe more, as according to some people, by pharmaceutical industry, chemical industry, artificial intelligence industries. All these are private sectors. Today, the richest people in the world are not governments. It is these companies, science tech companies. All of them impact our society so deeply, whether it's for the so-called good of development or various other social processes, but the fact is they impact society. So don't we want to understand what it is? What is this machine which is impacting all our lives so deeply? Don't we want to know what that thing called science really is? That is what we try and do. When we ask the question, what is science? It is not to try and say, oh, science is good or bad. That is irrelevant. A philosophical reflection or a historical reflection is to understand, how did this thing called science come about? That's a historical reflection. People say that science does not begin in other societies and cultures. It's a specific product of Western Enlightenment and European. There's a very specific historical trajectory in European Enlightenment. Very good. How do you understand it? What led to that process? That's a historical understanding of the object called science. You could have a sociological understanding. That is to ask yourself this question. And we should all ask this question. Science is impacting us so deeply today. Everything, including the way the roads are, the climate problem, the pollution. I can tell you from coming from Bangalore, the pollution in Bangalore has impacted children's health so deeply that so many children are on this bronchi, they keep inhaling those inhalers. And we think that's got nothing to do with science. It's part of what we call as development and how science impacts society. So when all of that is happening, you have to ask the question, how do I understand it? How do I respond to it? Do any of us have any control over how science is building, where it is growing? Is there anybody who asks us the question, what kind of imagination of the world that we want? We have built such high technologies like the smartphones, etc. Very smart people have done that. Very rich people also. But we have not put in that fraction of the effort to produce a more harmonious society. Is that so difficult that you think it's easier to build all these huge science and defense establishments? Today we have more missiles and war machines, whatever you call these things which use in war, which can destroy weapons in war, which can destroy the world 100 times over. Forget about destroying the world. You can annihilate the world and the solar system if you like. We've just built it. Whose money is it that has gone into the building of this? Whose money has gone into building of enormous amount of biological research? How many of us know that the kind of biological research that is happening in the labs around the world? Biological research, producing biological organisms which are very toxic. How many of us know? And you think if I go and ask somebody, they'll tell me? They'll say, no, you don't have the qualifications to know what it is. Earlier, so we have to understand the growth of science, what science has become. It was some way when it began. It has become something else now. And all of us as members of society have a right to ask, what is this thing called science which is influencing our lives so much? That is the question of what is science. Not about whether, I'm not even saying all these are bad influences, not at all. Science has done enormous amount of good in various ways. We accept all that. We want to understand because we want to have a say. We will not be robots in a society in which somebody is dictating how we will all evolve without having a say. So you have to ask the question, who is doing science in India? Who are the people who are doing science in India? What kind of institutions are they? I'm sure you have heard about this, just to show you the larger questions of things. How many women are there in our science institutions? What is the percentage of women who are actually in our doing science, producing this thing called science in India? How many people who are actually, I'm asking this question not because I'm at CMI, but I'm asking this question because we have asked this question outside. How many Muslims are there who are part of the science community in India? What is this question about religion and the practice of science? Who are the people who are all your, very famous scientists all over? What about the caste distribution in the Indian scientists? Where is the representation of an enormous number, the bedrock of society, in the most rich and the most powerful community in India today? It's not a criticism of them. We want to understand it. We want to understand what is so special to science that all these people have been kept out of it. And who is keeping them out of it? Under what excuse is that happening? All of this goes back to a simple question that we need to understand the importance of science, to know what its values are, so that we are also aware of what its potential dangers could be. When I'm saying this, I'm not saying, oh, we are all anti-science and should be worried about it. I'm just saying no social authority can exist without examination. No social authority, any figures of authority in a society has to be examined. That's the fundamental meaning of democracy. Otherwise, authority and power by definition can become very totalitarian, can become very inegalitarian. Any notion of power. Today, Science is in a position of power in our society. Why? Look at education. Right from school, what do we teach? What is the emphasis in our education system? Science. I know children in 6th standard in Bangalore. I don't know how it is in Chennai. I'm sure it is the way in Chennai, Andhra for sure. 6th standard in school, they go to IIT coaching classes. They come, they leave home at 6:30, come back at 8:30. Because from school, many schools have IIT coaching within that school system itself. After the regular class, they do 4 hours of coaching. And once one of my cousin's young daughter, one day when I'd gone to the house, she said, "Oh, I got AIR of 350 or something." And I was like, totally sure. I didn't know what AIR meant. She's 6th standard. So I said, "What is AIR?" She said, "All India rank." Every Sunday, they are writing exams, training them so that they can write on IIT exam. Science, who has decided this? The people who think a modern society can only be based on the foundations of science education have influencing our children from the age they are 5 years, 6 years, 7 years old. Should we not ask the question, why are you not giving that much emphasis on teaching them poetry and songs and literature? Or teach them sports and dance? Who has taken this decision that this is going to be the foundation of our thinking? And to what end? And as you go higher classes, it becomes obviously more and more, So everything you see, whether it's about children, with our education, with our institutions, with our larger society, science has a great impact. And we cannot afford to just say, I can't think, I can't ask, what is it? I want to understand. Then the question comes, who can? So let us accept for all these reasons we want to understand. Then who can understand? Who has the competence to understand? You might say, scientists like to say that scientists are the ones who have the competence to understand science because they are doing all this hard physics and chemistry and biology. They sit in labs, and doing science is one of the most difficult things, like many other human activities. I mean, I've worked with various people who are artists, performance artists. They also work very, very hard. Okay. There are no big government support for them like you have for science. So that's okay. Everybody is working very hard at whatever they need to do. Scientists work very hard. It's a very competitive, very difficult field, especially, research in science, not just teaching in science. I'm really talking about the larger science power, within major science research institutions. So they work very hard. And that's, as far as part of the way in which society functions, and we have, they have enough support for it, etc., etc. And when they work very hard, they also produce very specialized knowledge, specialized language. So, we all think we can read any book in literature. I may not be an English teacher. Okay, I may not know how to read like English professors can. But you give me a novel, I can read it. Any of you will open a novel, we'll all read it. Literature, we think, is accessible to us. Now, what is the big deal? Okay, I may not understand it like the way these professors understand it, but I can read it. I can access it. You try accessing a book in physics if you're not a physics student. You can't read it. You open a book in mathematics, impossible. You could be reading some other language. It is another language. It's like asking you to read, let's say none of you know Kannada, for example. I give you a book in Kannada and say, okay, read it. You're going to open it and you say, oh, I don't know what it is because I don't understand the language. So it is a specialized, so some people can do it, etc. But the question is, should people who do it, are they the best judge of what it is? This is the fundamental question. People who do it, are they the ones who understand it best? I'll give you 2 examples to say why it is not. Let's look at the question of, any of the shopkeepers on this road, millions of shops here. Every shopkeeper is dealing with money. I mean, not today, now with all the phone pay and all that, but let's say traditionally we give money and they give you money back. Transaction of money is happening enormously in this road right now at this time. Do you think all the shopkeepers know the meaning of money? Do they understand economics? Do they understand what it means to produce these notes? They can transact very well. They'll give you correct change. They can bargain. They can do anything. They can run huge business and make enormous profit. Do they know the meaning of money? Have they understood the nature of money? I'm not saying they haven't understood. They definitely have some understanding, but not in the way, let's say, an economist or a banker or a philosopher who talks about money understands it. So just because we are very good in doing something doesn't mean we have understood it all. Look at a more common example, language. We all speak language. We all read, write. We are all very good in language, whichever language we do, English, Tamil, Kannada, whatever. But do we understand language? It's one of my favorite themes of thinking about, because language is one of the most complex concepts in the world. Linguists were a special branch, what they call a scientific study of science, to put it in old terminologies. It's definitely an analytical study, at least, of language. Linguists know something about language that all of us are very good users of language we don't know. You may be writing fantastic Tamil poetry, but then you'll have to go to a linguist like Salman here to say, okay, explain to me, what is this thing? What are all the rules of combination of these phonemes and these sound units? How do they produce a sentence? How do they produce a word? Linguists, if I talk to people who are linguists and work on English, I thought I knew English, but when I talk to linguists, I realize I don't know anything about English. Because they have an understanding of language from a different perspective. Or you go to a literature class, like literary theory, like Padmini here would do. She can teach a Tamil text in ways very different from what, when I read it, I may not know like she knows. She has a different understanding of what that poem or novel would be. Whereas all of us will read it. We can all still be very good producers of things. So in other words, this is a question that's often been asked. Are writers the best judge of knowing what language is? Very good writers. You take your best writers in Tamil, good novelists, short story poem writers. Do you think they know language in the way linguists do? In the way professors of English or Tamil know? Or in the way philosophers talk about language? I'm sure many writers, and you can add to this, but I'm sure many writers will say, well, I don't know what it is. I'm just writing it. I'm very good at doing it. I'm very good at doing it, but I don't know what. I don't know the kind of things, knowledge you have about language. Without having the knowledge about language, what language is, I'm still able to do it very well. In fact, better than the people who have knowledge. So that is where all the constant fight comes. And it's most powerfully expressed with cinema filmmakers. Filmmakers will often say, I'm sure you've heard this many times, but they say this about critics all the time. People who don't know how to make films write about it. People who don't know how to write novels will write criticism about books and so on. What they mean is to say, well, these are two different kinds of skills. You can have a great filmmaker, and I'm not saying they won't know what is film. They have all thought about it, but they won't talk about it like English department, culture studies department write about films. I have a very good friend who's a filmmaker, and his constant joke will be like, he'll say, we are talking about a film. He'll say, oh, this film is now destroyed because somebody has written an article in EPW about it. So the moment somebody has done it, he says, oh, finished. They have written some absolute thing which none of us understand and we don't pay attention to it. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. I'm just saying that an object can be looked at from many different perspectives. And we have to look, different people bring different knowledge when they look at it from different perspectives. And if that is true for every human activity, including this object called the chair, a carpenter who looks at the chair will understand it differently from a designer who's looking at the chair, from somebody who's looking at a chair for various other reasons. A businessman who looks at the chair is immediately thinking, what can I sell it for, in terms of, let's say, profit and so on. Each perspective produces some knowledge about that object. That the whole point of saying all this is just to say that. And you have to be sometimes outside that object to understand it very well. That's the basic idea, because you bring your specialization in order to understand it. So now apply all this to science. Science is a very powerful influence in our lives. It's a powerful influence in society. Everything that we are doing today has been so deeply influenced by some policies in science and impact of science. And then we say, since it impacts us so much, I want to understand a little bit about it. I want to understand it from my perspective. What are the different perspectives to understand science? You could ask, for example, one way to look at it is through history of science. And you could ask, how did this historically come about? How did the science come about historically? Who helped the establishment of the first science institutions? How did it become what it has become today? Who has supported it, etc., etc. That's a historical analysis. Just because you do science doesn't mean you know the history of science. And history of science gives you some information about science. In the same way, what I want to say a little bit about is the use of philosophy to understand science. You know, how does a philosophical understanding of science help us? So that is really the question which I'm going to address a little bit more. You can, as I said, you can do about the history, you can ask the sociology, etc. But let's look at what philosophy of science can help us understand this thing called science. And we're not interested in saying, you know, very few philosophers will say, I'm doing this because I want to criticize science or I want to say it's a great thing. We want to understand what it is. In fact, a lot of philosophers look at science just like scientists look at nature. It is, you know, the method of philosophical thinking about something is a lot like scientific thinking about nature. And it is not an accident. Science comes from philosophy. The methods of science come from methods of philosophy. Isaac Newton, the most famous scientist most people know, was not called a scientist. He was called a natural philosopher. In his most famous book, it is the most important book for modern physics, what we call classical physics. You know, the Newton's law of motion, Newton's law of gravity, which I'm sure all of us, even non-science students, know about. You know, Newton's laws, in that book, when he writes about it, he uses what he calls 4 rules of philosophical method. It's a beautiful document. You should read that book for the fun of it. As literature students, we should read that book. It's one of the first attempt to understand what does it mean to philosophically think about nature. That's what Newton is doing. The methods of thinking about it, he is calling as philosophical method. So the fact that science is doing something, you know, trying to understand. So why science breaks away from philosophy is science, as for various reasons, there are questions you can talk about it, decides that they will only look at nature in one particular manner. They will focus their attention on what they call as natural phenomena through one particular process. Philosophy was looking at everything. It was looking at, you know, human beings, looking at society, looking at politics, etc. And it also became too much like a Shastra. It became too much caught in textbooks. So the Greek tradition led to what is called the scholastic tradition, where a lot of philosophy just became reading books. So they were completely immersed in the books, but they didn't see the world outside. So the first revolution, so science is a philosophical revolution. It begins by questioning this belief of philosophers. You're all sitting in your houses and looking into your books so much, you're not looking at the world outside. Go look at the world outside in order to understand it. So science tries to understand nature around us. What is natural phenomena? Just like it tries to understand nature, philosophy tries to understand science as an object outside. It tries to understand it in very similar ways by which science understands nature. So imagine there is science all around us. What do we mean by science? There are scientists, science institutions, various processes happening around us. I want to study it. So one way you could study is to say, I want to do a scientific study of science. How to understand it? I want to scientifically study. So we have Professor Subbaiah Arunachalam, one of the foremost founder of Indian scientometrics, a field which is actually a scientific study of science, which is what do? They measure various things about science. So when you talk about science institutions, so science institutions, No. So they may talk about how many papers are published, who is publishing it, all those kinds of metrics. You can do a scientific study of science in that way. That's one way, the important way. When we do a philosophical study, what do I do? When I do a philosophical study, what we mean is this. Philosophy has some very basic questions. First, for example, one of the most important basic questions of philosophy is a definition. What is something? So philosophy is always about questioning something to make sense of the thing, right? So you might say there is something called art. Let's say a dance form. A philosophical question is to say, what is this thing called? How do you define dance? Definitions is true in every subject. Remember that all academic subjects have come from philosophy. Very similar methods are used in all of them. So it's not a surprise. But when I ask for a definition, so the question of art is very interesting. Somebody draws something and somebody calls it modern art. You know, I remember once seeing in one museum abroad, very famous piece of painting. And it's one of the special pieces of modern art. And I went and saw it. It was a canvas with just one color painted on it. There is no shapes, forms, nothing. One color, some reddish shade, fully one color thing. That's it. That is art. So you'll ask yourself, why is that art? If I paint that, you know, you won't even pay me the cost of paint for it. Whereas for this, you pay $1 million. You can't even buy it. It's so expensive. And remember this famous example of Marcel Duchamp, the French artist, who took a urinal and kept it in a museum and called it a work of art. And so we all think, wow, that's a great piece of art. Because it's in a museum, he's got a title, and you look at a urinal and say, that's art. What Duchamp was also doing was it's an exercise of asking, what is art really? You know, he's entering into it and playing with that question. Asking the question, what is something, is a very important question which philosophy always attempts to answer. It's a very standard bread and butter question for us. You say, how do you distinguish this painting from a drawing of a child? And these are becoming very important. Yesterday, we were having this very interesting chat about AI and the chat bot and whatever those things are. Tomorrow, some of the best art is going to be produced by these machines. Tomorrow, the best literature, music, art is going to be produced by them. You won't even know if it's produced by humans or machines. So the question of how do I define what is art is a very important question. And in the same way, I want to ask the question, how do you define science? Is science only that done in science institutions? There have been so many traditional artisans who do so many things, including blacksmiths, weavers. You know, they're producing things, also knowing their knowledge they have about those things are so deep. Are they doing science? And you might ask, why do you want to call them as doing science? Because if you say that they're doing science, I can write to the Department of Science and Technology and get a huge grant. You know, in fact, I want to call my subject science because I can get money for doing it. You'd say, I want to write poetry and see how many people will give you money to do that. Suppose if you say, I want to do science of poetry, maybe you will get money. You know, I was told this by the secretary of DST once when I was trying to tell them, you know, you should establish a center for philosophy and history of science. He looked at all the project and then he tells me, he says, you know, this philosophy of science and all is okay. I don't think it's very useful. You rewrite your proposal to say you want to do science of philosophy, I'll fund you. Whatever that means, I don't know what it meant. But the idea is, what I'm trying to say is, to know what is science is an important question for us because our survival depends on it. Because it's very important to know what science is. So how do you define it? Who defines what is science? Only the scientists? Who defines what is physics and what is chemistry? So I'm not saying they shouldn't. They are the ones who should do it. They are the ones who do it. They know it best. But we need to understand that social process. We can ask the question, what is a social process by which something is accepted as science, something is not accepted as science? What is a social process? Who decided it? How did you decide? What are the processes behind it? We just want to understand it. We're not telling them they don't have a right. I don't want to go tell a physicist they cannot define what is physics. because they are not only smart, they have done so much of work, they know it. But I want to understand, it's a social process. Science, there is no science without it being a social process. Supported by society, supported by people. The whole thing is built because a larger society supports it. So we have a right to know what we are supporting. So what is science is one typical philosophical question. In the early origins of philosophy of science, this becomes a very important question for a person like, I'm sure many of you have heard of Karl Popper, Popper. Very often people who talk of philosophy of science say Popper. And Popper was trying to find out what distinguishes a discipline like psychology from physics or astrology from physics. Both of them can be like disciplines. People, you can do a lot of work in calculation in astrology. You can do something in psychology, a lot of theory and so on. But Popper thought that there is some difference between the two. And you should be able to make that difference. Otherwise, everything will become a science and you lose the value of science. So this idea that you can define what science is so as to demarcate it, it's called the demarcation criteria, to distinguish it from one subject to another, is an important function of philosophy of science. So philosophy of science is trying to understand what is it that makes one subject something special to it. And if you ask ourselves a question, is there something very special to the act of science? We often keep saying this, science, physics is science, chemistry is science, biology is science. Today, everybody calls themselves a science. There is management science, food science, nutrition science, dance science. There's a field it is called wine science, on scientifically tasting wine, I guess, or scientifically getting drunk. I'm just joking. That they would kill me. They have definitions of it. They have something called home science, which is very special to India. Very important. A lot of women in India go and study home science. So I went and asked in one department, what do you actually do as home science? I was very curious. There is now a PhD program also in it, I was told, in SMDT University. And if I went and looked up at one of their websites on home science, it has a beautiful definition. It says, a scientific utilization of domestic resources. Scientific use of how much dal and rice and chili and mustard, etc. you're going to use in your cooking. A scientific use of it. Today, that term has become so common. Everything I read in newspapers today, I think the media is also obviously loves this term. Yesterday, I was reading some newspapers and says, oh, the road was not done scientifically. The median of the road is not done designed scientifically. You use the word scientifically to say it has an independent value, whether you do it according to science or not. So you tend to use the word science, but scientists want to distinguish it. They don't want to. In fact, if you go to a science institute, as I'm sure some of you have done, you will find that there's a hierarchy. So people who wrote about Indian science earlier used to call that hierarchy in terms of the caste system of hierarchy. The experimentalists come, this is the normal narrative. Okay, there are obviously small differences. Experimentalists are seen as equivalent to the laborers, the laboring class, the lowest. Then you have higher and higher disciplines. So the whole kind of a caste system is reproduced in the value you give to certain types of science. So the mathematical, theoretical has a very highest value, and then it filters down. And if you think science is just one term, I'm sure you would, if you're not from science institutes, you'll be surprised that even within a physics department, the knowledge is so specialized that somebody working in one discipline cannot understand another person working in another discipline. They won't even go to those lectures. Physics department people rarely will go to a chemistry department or biology department lecture because they won't understand it. You think they're all doing science. And you ask them, what are you doing, which is common, why it is called science? It's not an easy answer to give. It is a task of philosophy of science to inquire into, to try and understand what is special to physics. How does it differ from chemistry? How does it differ from biology and so on? So this is a very deep question which philosophy of science can do. Then what else does philosophy of science do? There's a very important, what gives value to science? A very important value to science comes from the idea of truth and the idea of knowledge. We think science is special because science has something called knowledge, scientific knowledge. That scientific knowledge is different from other types of knowledge. Fine, that's very good. But how do you define knowledge? which discipline is going to define what knowledge is? Which discipline is going to give you the definition of truth? If you really ask, what do you mean by knowledge and truth? You have to go back to philosophy, because the foundations of philosophy, the discipline called epistemology, is about the theory of knowledge. It asks the question, how do you define knowledge? Is knowledge different from, let's say, belief? So I believe, let's say, the earth is round. Would you say you believe the earth is round, or do you know that the earth is round? If you say, I know the earth is round, what is the difference between belief and knowing? The fact that it can be very, so we build that. So we build this thing. If I want to move from belief to knowledge, I'm going to do various things. Verification is one aspect. It can, in a larger context, we call it is justified in various ways. So you can build, for where do you get all that way of thinking about what knowledge is? Where do these questions come from? They come from philosophy. So when philosophy of science is looking at scientific knowledge, it is asked the question, like he said, it is verified. So we'll ask the question, what is verification? What is evidence? So people often say today, science is evidence-based knowledge. That's a very good definition of science. Evidence-based knowledge, or an empirical science. That is how science differs from philosophy and other disciplines, in that everything that it says, it needs evidence to back it. But there's a fantastic, enormous amount of very interesting work in philosophy of science, which asks the question, what is evidence? When does something become evidence, and when is it not evidence? How do you know something is an evidence for some piece of knowledge? And if you look at it, if you have any questions, you can talk about it. But I'll give you just one example of how philosophy of science illuminates. There is an argument that evidence is given by facts. You see something in the world and you think, oh, that fact proves this scientific theory. The first thing when philosophers of science who looked at the process of science, they didn't just talk about, they looked at how science is done. They discovered that evidence is not obvious at all. You can look at the same data and you can actually come to a completely different scientific theory. For example, a very famous example in philosophy of science is the Earth going around the sun and the sun going around the Earth, the geocentric and the heliocentric model. So when we talk about the story of science, people often say when Copernicus and Galileo proposed the fact that the Earth goes around the sun, that is the beginning of modern science, because they broke the hold of the church, which held the view that the sun goes around the thing. So people often call the religion-science conflict, etc., based on this kind of a story. But the point is, ask yourself, what is the evidence that the Earth is going around the sun, or sun is going around the Earth? What constitutes evidence for it? How do I verify this? Interestingly, if you look at the earlier model of astronomy, what is called the Ptolemaic model, where the sun goes around the Earth, the data, the observation which Ptolemy used is almost the same as Copernicus. Copernicus, who gives a radical thesis that the Earth is going around the sun, based his theory not on data, not on facts, not on evidence, which was different from Ptolemy. They both had the same set of observations, which basically observations of the sky, where the stars and constellations are. What differs between Ptolemy and Copernicus is Copernicus had a different philosophical assumption, which made him change his idea of using the same data to give a different theory. This raises a larger question. How much of what we call as evidence and facts are dependent on the theory that you hold? It's true in normal or ordinary life. Suppose you're all listening to me seriously, thinking I'm actually saying something serious because, he introduced me as something, teaching philosophy or whatever. Suppose after some time he gets up and says, okay, 1 hour is over. I actually want to tell you he's actually a gardener. He has never studied science nor philosophy. He's just come here and today we thought we'd just have something, we let him talk what he wants. Then you're going to ask, till now what you thought I was saying something serious and truthful. You say, oh, was this guy, were they all truthful or not? That is, your theory influences the world. We are not Indian, and this is a very, very important philosophical theme which comes around in various philosophical disciplines, whether Indian, Western, Kant, modern. ancient. That is, does the human being influence the world that we see? The fundamental question of philosophy. And that's where philosophy and science radically break. Because for science, what is there in the world is independent of us. Humans do not matter to the truths of the world. But every truth of the world is filtered through me. The world appears for my eyes this way. There is nothing real in this room. If a dog is standing here and looking at the room is going to look very different for the dog. And if the dog wrote a theory of the room, it will be a completely different theory. An insect, like a beetle which looks at this room, for example, will look at it as curved, not like this. And if it writes a description of this room, it will be a very different room than what you and I are going to see. So if all observation and therefore all facts are influenced by human presence in different ways, and just like the eyes, it can be our mind which influences how we see something. It can be our history which influences how you see something. How you see a person is dependent on your visual cognitive structures. Look at all the communal riots. Look at Nazism. What was the first, a very powerful interview with one of the Nazi commanders when they asked him, how did you send all these people to their death? How did you do that? And that fellow says, I didn't have a problem because I saw all these Jews as animals. They were not humans. So I didn't have a problem. In communal riots, you see how people use when they do the most horrible things, particularly to women and children and others. What do they do? What do they use? What do they talk about the other person? The way they see them. They're not humans. I can do what I want to them. Right? We perceive the world. We produce these facts. We produce this evidence. And that influences how we see the world. Again, this doesn't mean that science is right or wrong. That's not the point. The point is, what does a philosophy of science do? So maybe many scientists do say this. They say, oh, you can ask all these questions. It doesn't matter to physics or science. Nothing, scientific truths are like that. It doesn't matter to that. So why should you do what you want? We are not going to. In fact, in Indian science institutions, it's so difficult to teach philosophy of science, history of science, sociology of science, because they feel it's irrelevant. Why should you have to learn all this about science? We are all doing very good science. So that's okay. But like any authority figure who wants to hold on to the authority, whether it's religion or science or caste hierarchies or class hierarchies, you should ask the question to them. Otherwise, what is the meaning of any notion of a democratic equal society? So this is one aspect of what philosophy of science does. Asking the question, what is knowledge? What is the nature of scientific truth? How does it differ from other kinds of truths, other kinds of knowledge? You can have knowledge about the world. You can have knowledge about morality. You can have knowledge about religion. So many of those things. All these questions are asked by philosophers because that is their job. That is their task. That's what they are trained to do. Okay, so that's a very interesting question. So, okay, I'll take the question, but yeah. No, so I'll just answer that and then get on. But please it's a very important point you raise. Philosophy may not question whether Earth goes around the sun. That is, philosophy of science, at least largely the traditional philosophy of science, is not questioning whether the scientists are right or wrong. Right? So they accept the fact that scientists are producing knowledge about the world and they are the experts. So I'm not going to question a doctor who knows something about the thing and tells, okay, this is your problem. What philosophers and larger science studies does is it will ask various questions on how that knowledge is produced by them. How did they come to know that this was doing? What was the history? So the history of science, people look at the long history of how did that idea come to Copernicus? It didn't just wake up one day. It came from, there are various questions about whether knowledge came from the Arabic philosophers, because they had a great contribution to the beginning of modern science in Europe, because the syllabus which influenced some of the greatest, scientists, including Galileo and others, came from the knowledge which was produced by the Islamic philosophers who produced this work, who saw themselves as the true inheritors of Greek thought. They saw themselves as the true inheritors of Aristotelian thought, who transmitted it to Europe. So, there is that kind of a question we can ask. Eventually, it's a very important question you're asking. Will a philosopher of science say, no, your theory is right or wrong? We won't say that. But that's mainly because philosophy of science has been kept aside in a long way. Some people who try to integrate it believe that a philosophy of science will also help for better new ideas in science to grow. For example, some of the most important scientists, including, as I said, Galileo, Newton, or Einstein. Einstein, if I remember right, held the first philosophy of science chair in Europe. Because, his theory of relativity comes from philosophical questions. Sorry? Yeah, but all the German philosophers were very deeply influenced by, philosophy. They were all trained in philosophy. Yeah, definitely, yeah. Yeah, but I'm saying in terms of not just of his influence, his questioning, the basic questions he was asking were very deeply influenced by what we think is our philosophical questions. And, I taught a course last 2 semesters for, the undergrad students at IIS, Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore, it's called Philosophical Base of Scientific Concepts. So we read Newton's book and also Einstein's theory, a special theory of relativity paper, because I wanted them to see how ideas are first generated, that it is not just some answer thing. And one of the things I read with them was a beautiful piece, Einstein's famous special theory of relativity paper. We might think, oh, that is so complex, how can we understand it? Where the foundation of that is? It's a very simple question. It's a very short paper. It's a very easy read for the first part. You know what he says? He says, a train reaches the platform at 7 p.m. Okay? That's all. It is just that. No, it's okay. No. The train reaches a platform at 7 p.m. Okay, this is a physics paper, the beginning of special theory of relativity. And you know what he says? He says, we take it for granted. We assume, oh yeah, train has reached the platform at 7. But he says the meaning of that statement, what is the meaning of the statement? The meaning of the statement is 2 events have happened. The train has reached, the clock at the same time the train reaches shows 7 p.m. We don't even think about it. He went back to this basic thinking. He said, when I say a train reaches at 7 p.m., I'm saying 2 things have happened. One, the train has reached the platform. Secondly, at the same time that the train reaches, the clock also shows 7 p.m. So this sentence is dependent on the idea of simultaneity, that both these events have happened simultaneously. And the whole theory of relativity is a critique of simultaneity, where he points out it is impossible for 2 things to be simultaneous. Such a fantastic piece of pure thinking. What I would see as a very pure philosophical thinking. He's not doing any mathematics there. He's not asking any simple, saying 2 things have happened, and that sentence means 2 things have happened simultaneously at the same time. And then he asks the question, can 2 things happen at the same time? How do you know they happen at the same time? No 2 things can happen at the same time because it takes time for a signal from one to come to the other. You need a frame of reference to know whether 2 things happen simultaneously. That is the beginning of the monumental revolution in science called relativity. What I'm trying to say is, Einstein was a philosopher in that sense. He's asking deep questions about basic concepts, the way we understand the world. That is what philosophy of science does. And today, if there is a lot of struggle between the two, it's because for various reasons, people have felt that, the people who have the authority to speak about science should only be scientists. Nobody else should speak about it. There are very many other questions. I'll just end with the last 2 minutes. One thing about a very interesting question, which is also maybe of interest to some of you, and it's of great interest to me as an idea. This is the question of mathematics. Mathematics, everybody tells you, is very special to science. In fact, Galileo makes mathematics the heart of science when he writes that nature is a book written in the language of mathematics. So to do science for Galileo was just to read the open book. That's an image which comes from the book of God, book of nature, ideas. Okay. So that is, all of scientific truths are there in nature, but nature has written it in mathematics, not in Kannada, Tamil, English, any other language. So it is there. And that's all I have to do. This question of mathematics and sciences has puzzled every scientist, because the question is about mathematics, especially in the Western tradition. Mathematics has always been very closely related to theology, to religion. It is mathematical objects like numbers and stuff are often seen to have a completely independent truth, completely independent reality. They are not like things in the world. You know, numbers like 3, 4, 5, 6 are not like chairs and tables and all of us. They don't have space. They don't have size. They don't have weight. They don't have smell. They don't have taste. But yet, they exist. They exist in an eternal, unchanging form. Newton, very deeply influenced, his greatest work in physics comes because he brings mathematics to describe nature, believes that mathematical entities represent the qualities of God. He calls space and time a sensorium of Godhead, where the qualities of eternality is geometry, the omnipresence is represented by geometry and eternality by arithmetic. It's a tradition which he gets from his teachers and so on. The point is, given all this, even today, one of the most interesting questions is, we don't understand why mathematics is so important to the doing of science. Why is it so important? So a very famous physicist who won a Nobel Prize, Wigner, wrote a piece called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. Very important piece saying, we don't know, it shouldn't work so much. Why does it work? Why is it so powerful? Why is it so necessary? That is a question which philosophers can ask. Because philosophers ask the question about nature of existence, nature of things. Are numbers as real as chairs and tables? That's a valid question. You can give whatever answer. But scientists are not asking that question. They are busy using mathematics and numbers. Philosophers can ask that question, what is the nature of mathematical knowledge? What is the nature of mathematical objects? And that very important questions in order to understand. So I come back finally to the point that a lot of this philosophy of anything is a way of a deeper understanding. What does a deeper understanding mean? Doesn't mean more wiser understanding. Deeper means bringing in different perspectives. Because remember, as human beings, we recognize something about our perception, our sight, that no object looks like the way it is. Every object looks the way it is from a particular perspective. If you look at this chair and you tell me this is how a chair looks, it's because you're seeing it from there. You're seeing it in this light. You're seeing it sitting down. When I see it when he's seeing the chair, the same chair, he's seeing it differently. When I'm seeing it from top, I'm seeing it differently. From the back, I'm seeing it differently. An ant under the chair is looking at the chair differently. So what is the chair? The carpenter can't ask all these questions. He wants to do something and give it and sell it. The philosopher can have the freedom to do this. And hopefully the leisure and hopefully the support from a state a little bit to do this, which is not happening. But what I'm saying is, they are trying to say every knowledge, you have to look at it from different perspectives. Sociology brings different perspectives to look at the activity of science, and so on. So philosophers bring different questions around in order to understand. That's what I mean by You cannot understand this chair unless you've looked at it from where you have sat on it, you throw something on it, you try and light a matchstick and see if it burns. If you want to do that, if you allow people to do it, we do it in the laboratories, right? You take something and you break it. So that is all that we try and do. And that should not make other people worried about what we are doing. They're just trying to understand the deeper nature of it. It may be irrelevant. You might say it's all a waste. We want to do science indeed. We will produce the world's most toxic biological organism without all these philosophical questions. I said, fine, you go do it, but we are worried about what you're doing. So from different perspective, ethics perspective, knowledge perspective, truth perspective, we reflect on the nature of science. In particular, we have to remember, because science is a social phenomena, it also has deep implications on how you study society. And I just ended 2 lines on it. We use the word science, like I said, home science, wine science, nutrition science, everything to study something scientifically. We do it a lot within the larger context of what we call social science. And that's important, whatever that means. As we said, science is about verification, some evidence for what you want to say. If I want to say something about the nature of, the society in Triplicane, or I should have some idea, I should have lived here, I've learned, whatever it is. Some method is there to produce that knowledge. So in the social science, when we study society and human beings, what kind of methods of thinking about it should I do? If I want it to be scientific, what does it mean? Why do I want to have a scientific study of human beings and society? What do I get out of it? Again, these are very important questions. I'm not reducing it. There is some importance when you do it that way. A scientific question, for example, I'll give you a very quick example of understanding what a scientific question is. A scientific question is one which will break down a larger question into smaller parts. It's the first simple example of doing science. No biologist is asking the question, what is life? That only teenage angst and teenage philosophers will ask that question, what is life? They don't ask the question, what is life? They'll ask, what is chromosome? What is DNA? What does it mean for these organisms to reproduce, etc. Big questions are reduced to small answerable questions. Breaking down an object into the smallest parts which you can resolve. That's a very important part of the scientific method, or the analytical method. So we can study society like that. I can study society by looking at you in terms of numbers, because the idea of mathematics and quantitative is very important to science. So I can look at, in fact, the first great definition of science is description of the world through measurable concepts. A Galilean description, which is still so true today, which is, I can write about a phenomenon, right? As long as I describe it using concepts that I can measure, then you're doing science. So if an object is falling, I can write poetry about it. I can sing a song about it. But the moment I describe it saying there is a measurable height, h, time it takes, speed at which it falls, I have done scientific description. Very important. You look at any example of science, you will see it's in terms of concepts which are measurable. Everything. There is no non-measurable concept for science. You won't use the word like the stone is feeling happy as it falls down. Doesn't make sense. But if you can measure happiness, scientists will accept it. You'll say it is 3.4 units of happiness, then it's fine. It's a very important aspect of what it is to do science. If you bring it into social science and look at measurement, and my favorite example is poverty, and I repeat it because it's a very good example. If I want to study poverty in a society, how do I understand poverty? Like the question I began with. If you want to do a scientific understanding, I can say, well, I have, the major reports, government reports. One report said, if you earn less than 30 rupees a day, you are poor. It's a measurable concept, how much you earn. I can go to each one and ask, how much do you earn, how much do you earn? Then I can give a number and say, oh, you are poor. That person will say, no, I'm not poor, I'm actually not poor. But he said, no, you're earning less than 30 rupees, so you're poor. Numbers, you quantify poverty. Earlier, they had a calorie value. They said if you eat less than, let's say, 1,000 calories, if your intake is less than, let's say, 1,000 calories, you are below poverty line. It's a measurable concept. Numbers, right? So science, it is very important because it allows you to do government policy. It tells you how many people are poor, what policy you should do. But did you understand poverty? Do you understand poor people? What it means to be poor? What it means as a social phenomena to be poor? How to get out of that poverty? You need different methods. So scientific is an important part of one element of it, but particularly in the study of societies and others, we need to look at far broader, deeper kind of perspectives, which includes drawing on history, sociology, philosophy, to ask these questions. What is it to be human? What does it mean to be a human community? Why are we social beings or are we individual beings? These are questions which are not a scientific method with social science, but other methods to understand. So I want to leave this thing with just the reflection that whether it's philosophy or not is secondary. I don't have any this one to it. Now I don't even work in any department in philosophy. It doesn't matter to me. But the question of understanding, that's important for us to think about. And for us to come to a decision, what do you want to do when you say, I want to understand this in a more broader, deeper sense? What should I do? What should I know? How do I do it? And all I can say is, if you are interested in this search, of course, philosophy is going to be of great help because that's the task of it. It is built its tools to do that job. So you can use it to reflect on certain things. But sometimes philosophy also becomes so inward, and as you said, within texts and flows, it's not a living discipline. So I would like to think of a true philosophy is a way to live with society, draw on these tools, produce your own tools of understanding something and asking new questions and new perspectives. And when we do that for science, we really understand this creature called science far better. And it is important to do it because of the great impact it has on each and every moment of our lives today. Thank you.
பழைய கதை ஒரு நியாய சாஸ்திரி வந்து அவங்க வீட்டுல இருந்து அவங்க வீட்டம்மா போய் கடற்கரை என்ன வாங்கிக்குவாங்க. உடனே அவரு யோசனையோட தான் இருக்காரு. நடந்தது கடற்கரையில என்ன வாங்கிட்டு வந்தாரு, என்ன வாங்கிட்டு வந்தாரு. உடனே அவர் என்ன பண்ணாரு, அம்மா கவுத்து போட்டாரு. அவர் வீட்டுக்கு போனாரா, அவங்க வீட்டம்மா என்ன கேட்டாங்க, பொதுவாக வந்து மக்கள் மத்தியில நியாய அந்த காலத்துல அறிவியல் பற்றி அவங்க எழுப்பின கேள்வி நான் என்ன நினைக்கிறேன், கேள்வி வந்து ரொம்ப ஆழமானது, வருத்தமானது. அறிவியலாளர்கள் அது எப்படி வந்து அறிவியல் அறிவார்ந்த மூலமாக வந்து ஒரு பெரிய சமூகத்தை வந்து கட்டிக் கொடுக்கும் அப்படிங்கிறதோட பிரச்சனை. அது வந்து வெறும் அறிவியல் அப்படிங்கிற அறிவியல் அப்படிங்கிற உற்பத்தி செய்யறது பண்றது வந்து மார்க்ஸ் அறிவியல் ஆதரவு மனப்பாங்குடைய கூடவே பிரச்சனை என்னன்னா, அப்ஸ்ட்ராக்ட் பண்றதன் மூலமா நெட்வொர்க் ஆக்குறது மூலமா என்ன செய்யுது, அதை வந்து உயிரோட இருக்கிற சோசியல் சயின்ஸா இருந்தாலும் சரி, நேச்சுரல் சயின்ஸா இருந்தாலும் சரி, அப்ஸ்ட்ராக்ட் பண்றதன் மூலமா அவங்க எவ்வளவு ஃபைனான்ஸ் கூடவே கணக்கில் எடுக்கணும் அப்படின்னு இரண்டாம் வகுப்பு முடிஞ்ச உடனே அறிவியலாளர்கள் கூட வந்து
இருந்தார், இந்தியாவிலதான்.
அவருடைய ஒரு வாஸ்தவம் வந்து நமக்கு நவீன காலத்துல அறிவியலாளர்களை வந்து அறிவியலாளர்களை வந்து எப்படி வந்து பூமார்களை வழி இந்த நூலுக்கு அவங்க பேசிட்டு இருக்க அறிவியல் நாங்க அப்படின்னு சொல்றதை பற்றி மட்டும் இல்லை, அந்த சயின்ஸ்னாவே அதனால வழக்கமான பதில்கள் வழக்கமான இருக்காம வந்து ஒரு கேள்விகளை ஒட்டுமொத்தமா கேட்க பிறகு உங்களுடைய கேள்விகளை
Yeah. But he is actually a philosopher. I mean, sorry, a scientist. He's not a, I mean, and it's interesting that he said, what is life? The reason he writes a philosophical question in a discipline he doesn't belong to. He's a physicist. And then, of course, he had a great influence in the beginning of molecular biophysics thanks to his work. But the point is, when he's talking about the question of life, he's asking a larger philosophy. Heisenberg wrote a fantastic philosophical book on the nature of reality. So they have written that not as the part of, it is not used for promotion for physics. Like you write it, they are not saying, oh, you're a great physicist, so we'll make you. So these are done because that German tradition at that time was very influenced by philosophy. Schrödinger was also very influenced by Schopenhauer and by Advaita. That is also there. I mean, he knew about it. They knew about various things. Well, why scientists will have a problem when they say influenced by, they will not accept it as influenced. They will say, well, I would say that he knew about it. And Schrödinger, in Schrödinger's case, I think he was influenced because he writes about it in the sense of how his understanding of the Vedantic idea of knowledge or the Advaitic idea of knowledge allowed him to imagine this possibility in a better manner or whatever. But scientists would be very worried when we say philosophy influence. I think with Einstein's case, like I gave the example of simultaneity, it's very clear. At least his early work, he's asking what is time and what is space. Those are all philosophical questions. So I think he was far more of that thing. But then after quantum theory and relativity theory, today science has become so specialized. Today, I forgot to mention this, science is not the way it was. So people who want to say, oh, science was just about open-mindedness, logic, etc., forget the fact. As I said, today, much of the funding of science is coming from private and the military sectors. Much of the work today, the amount of publications which are being produced, in one last count I was seeing, is more than 8,000 papers a day are published. Actually, millions of papers are being published. Today, I was told that there are curators, librarians to help faculty choose what articles to read because there's just too many. In this archival thing like PubMed, there apparently over 1 million articles are put every year. 2 articles a minute are uploaded. And these are all research articles. So much of knowledge is being produced. Even the science community doesn't know how to read it. So who is going to reflect on that? They are too busy. It's a competitive field, like I told you. You have to publish or perish. You have to keep on producing newer and newer work. But what is this new knowledge? And it has become so specialized that they're not going to do like the earlier tradition of going back to science. So every time we make a mistake thinking science began very well, science has very good, important qualities of open-mindedness. And to me, a very important quality is questioning authority. Very important at the beginning of modern science. Today's science is very different from what it was before. And so some scientists who want to hold on to the privilege of science keep saying, oh, science is like all this. But today's science is being run in a completely different, hyper-capitalist, military, commercial interests. And they're not even science knowledge is produced outside. You don't even know what they're producing. So we can ask that question. We can inquire into the changing nature of science.
Science of the day is right now.
Yeah.
Because, or would you prefer?
Yeah. Yeah.
And when you're all the work of religion is on. If anybody wants to do philosophy of religion,
Yeah.
it must have already been done.
Okay.
Science.
Yeah.
So my question is,
Yeah.
go back to those. Science because
Okay. Since you put it this way, let me also counter by saying that question is not correctly posed. It's not either or. First point. Okay. In the sense, having a deeper understanding of science doesn't mean that I have to go to something else. The science-religion dichotomy, by the way, is a very artificial distinction which has been used. No, that history has to be looked very carefully. No, let me explain. Yeah. That history is, no, I'll explain that. What I'm saying is, today a lot of science has been produced in a what I would call as a very simplistic model of science, including this grand story of Galileo fighting the church, the early Copernicus and Galileo fighting the church and so on, right? It's a very simplistic model. If you look at history of science as a discipline, where professional historians work only at this, you would see that that story is far more complex than what we are given in the name of science. So part of the growth of science as a powerful institution is by producing this image. So very interestingly, by the way, just to add to what you're saying, there's an important point. A lot of the methods which scientific community uses is very similar to what the religious community used in order to hold social authority, right? For example, how you present the nature of truth and knowledge, of its own knowledge, and who can be the, so some science writers, people who reflect on science, point out that scientists function, they call them the high priests of knowledge. To say that they gatekeep, they will interpret knowledge for you. They are your medium ground between ordinary, so-called ordinary people and this special knowledge called science. But this is an early part of science studies, from sociology and philosophers of science. And the point is, I'm not interested in their right or wrong. I mean, these points are open for discussion, right? The first point is the science-religion debate is actually completely misconstructed in a particular way in order to push at a particular definition of science. Western Enlightenment, European Enlightenment specifically, did have many factors, including capitalism, including fight against authority of monarchy, and a fight against the authority of the church. Ask yourself, where did Galileo fight with the church? Galileo, as you know, even when, that's exactly the point. Even, no, not that. No. It is not, they're too powerful. He was in very close friendship with the church. His house arrest was with the church leader, bishop, or whatever it is in those times. In fact, they didn't want to do anything to Galileo. He had a very good relationship with them. And where his problem with the church was? It was not about Christ or questions of God. It was about a statement about a natural phenomena which was differently explained by the church and by him. Religion is more than the explanation of natural phenomena. So Galileo you can have an overlap of whatever, as many scientists do today. If you really look, especially Indian science is filled with religiosity of very many different levels. Okay, the example, as you know, I'm sure if you don't, we should know that before, even in the most successful Indian organization like ISRO, before their launch, they would go to Tirupati and do puja before they send the launch. With the chairman of ISRO, no, that is very wrong. Sorry, I would disagree with you. No, I disagree with you. I'll tell you why. Because I've seen ISRO, I've studied science institutions. It's a very wrong mistake to think people like ISRO or DRDO are not doing science. And some handful of so-called theoretical scientists are doing science. It's completely mistaken. Indian science is not run by a handful of scientists sitting in some elite institutions, of which I know all of them because my NIAS is part of it. All my friends are part of it and I have very good conversation. I mean, tomorrow I'm going to another science institute to talk about something similar. We have conversations with them. It's not that we are making a position. And when you talk to scientists, I'm sure you have, if you're within that institution, ordinary scientists in the day-to-day work will talk to you about it. They'll tell you, yeah, this is what it is. It's only when they protect themselves from what they see as external influences, right? Yeah. I'm saying that's either wrong question. Yeah. No, as I told you, that's a wrong question because it is not either or. That's the first philosophical point. What I would ask is, I don't want to go back to religious explanation. Obviously, if that explanation is something which, as you correctly said, is not verified or not evidential, why would we accept it? Yeah, but having said that, what a philosopher of science can still do, should do, that is their work, okay, is to ask, what are the assumptions which led to the scientific knowledge? What are the other kinds of belief systems within science that allows you to produce this knowledge? That's all we ask. No philosopher of science. So I want to re-emphasize. I'm sorry for being very passionately re-emphasizing, because it's a false red herring question. No philosopher of science has ever said, even the most critical things about what the nature of knowledge is, has ever said, oh, the heliocentric model is wrong. Go back to geocentric culture. Hey, why would they even go back to that? There are different cultures in the world which have different religious beliefs. If you look at Indian contributions in the creation of Indian philosophy, there is really no contribute in religion and what we would call as mathematics and science. They produce an enormous amount of mathematics, for example, because they were seen as two separate things. Where there is a conflict, when science wants to say something which religion also wants to say, somebody has to adjudicate, and adjudicate based on certain methods. So if you believe abstraction is correct, if I can believe, I'll give you one example. Again, what you ask is very important. So I hope you don't misunderstand me, but I'm not disputing you, but I'm using it to raise a larger question. If you look at heliocentric model, look at Newton's work, Philosophica Mathematica, or mathematical principles of Newton. What does he do in that? He looks at the production of the Newton's laws of motion and the theory of gravity. How does he do that? He reduces the Earth and the Sun movement into a geometric problem. So you take the Sun and you take the Earth. Earth is so big, etc. Somebody mentioned something about abstraction, right? You take the Earth with all the people, the shapes, the size, the smell, the heat, and reduce it to a mathematical point. You take the Sun, remove all the qualities and reduce it to a mathematical point. Then you do geometry on it. And you know what? Newton knew this. If our today's scientists don't recognize it and know it, Newton knew it. He does the complete derivation in the first section of his book, and then he says, literally, what he says? He says, don't take me seriously. This is just mathematical model. This is mathematical force. This is not real force of the world. So if I question Newton's theory of gravity, not question, if I want to understand it deeper, I'm asking, how with all the qualities you have removed, except the mass point, right? That's all you need to do physics. How is that enough to capture the complete truth of the Earth going around the Sun? That's all. If you agree with me that that is part one, very important, and it is correct. It's absurd to say he's wrong. All that a philosopher will say is, that is one perspective based on these assumptions. Now, not just religion, philosophy also doesn't know how to do it, keeping all qualities and giving you a full broad answer. It doesn't know, right? But that's why I'm saying we don't do physics properly. We just start with assuming this stuff. But if you really look at how these ideas came about, they're all responding to philosophical questions, including Newton's on planetary motion. Fantastic. I mean, I love teaching that because it's so rich in thinking, how he's thinking through. So all I'm saying is science based on certain assumptions produces certain knowledge. So there's no either or. I can have many perspectives. If religion can be one of them, which we can dismiss or whatever it is, or whatever, depending on what you want, there could also be historical perspectives. There could be other perspectives which are not abstraction of this kind. You could have very different ways of looking at the Earth and the Sun and asking what is the thing. The good thing about all science is that they restrict what they want to do. So as Newton also says in his book, and we know like in physics even today, physics is nothing but the study of motions. How do I describe something moving? That's all. A lot of philosophy is there on it, but a different thing. Physics does it in a particular manner through measurable concepts. Fascinating study just to understand, how does something move? Why does it move? What sustains its motion? Really deep fundamental questions. And it is clear. And in what it says, it is right, given if I understand the assumptions in the context. No knowledge, unless it's a piece of very theological argument, that a knowledge can be completely outside of all contexts, outside of all humans. That to me is a religious claim. And science, if it does that, it's moved into that domain. Right? So philosophers of science are agnostics. They're not carrying a flag for anything. They're just trying to understand in that sense of it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Many Christian philosophers say that church disobeyed Galileo not because of the religious or They actually accepted it. But when he insisted, that it's not a mere model, like, he insisted it's not just a mere model, but it's how the universe actually is.
Yeah.
Which is
Yeah. Okay.
So would you agree with that? That's the case.
Okay. Okay. I don't know if you heard this. What you're saying is that the disagreement between the church and Galileo, he says, I mean, whether we'll come to that disagreement or not, is secondary, is that Galileo was saying what his knowledge is knowledge truly of the word, whereas the opponents would say it is a knowledge of a model. It is a very important question in philosophy of science. In fact, there's a model of science which we call the semantic model of science. And the semantic model of science is produced only through models. For example, you had the model of the atomic theory. The simplest model is the solar system. And you say, well, the atom and the electrons are like the solar system, and you can build a model like that. So a lot of models in science, typically, particularly in classical physics and so on, are models like the earth and the sun. It's not truly the earth and the sun. The earth is wobbling around. It's so big going around the sun. It's not a simple mathematical dot which is going around like this. So is scientific truth true of models alone? I'm extending your question, forgetting about that. Extending this to a very important question in philosophy of science today. Is the scientific truth and knowledge true about the models which you create rather than the true world? Right? So I can, for example, I produce a model of a building, and then I say how much pressure I hit, the building will break. So I can say you give so much pressure, the building will break. And then you extend it to a building. You say every building, if I hit, it's going to break. You will say, no, it's true of the model, not of the word. Science has to address this question. It's a very serious question posed to science. There are different ways by which it tries to do it. There are ideas called bridging principle. There are various arguments for it. There's also a very important argument about approximation. So the model produces something which is approximate to the word. It's not the word, but it's still approximate to the word. But for that, you need a concept of approximation. What does it mean? Again, to me, it's such wonderful, deep ideas, because approximation, we always talk in terms of numbers. 2 is very approximate to 1.99. Can you think of approximation without using numbers? What does it mean? Like we are two human beings. I don't know what it means. You might say, well, what is the notion of approximation? Is very important to science as a way to address this question. But in philosophy of science, even today, it's a very serious question, which is a serious challenge. All that it means is that scientific truth is right, largely right, approximately right, in that particular model, in that construct. But there could be other qualities. And an important part of science is its open-mindedness to be able to, if you reject it, it's fine with it. You could say, well, in this model is wrong. Why don't you add more qualities and let's see whether that's a better model? That's how science grows. So you keep changing model, you keep tinkering with models all the time. That's a very important part of it. That's also related to earlier church. There's a long history of that with both Neoplatonism, the church doctrines about reality and models, etc. But yeah, I want to use this just to connect to a larger question. All models, most models we do because it's useful. It's a cognitive way in which humans make sense of the world. We can never describe if I ask somebody to describe all the qualities in the room, it's impossible to describe it. The model I do, for the simplest model, I'll say there are 30 human beings in the room. That's a model. Or I might say there are 20 men and 10 women in the room. That's another model. There are so many other qualities which I have not used. Every description is a selective description. Some descriptions match far better than, suppose I said there are 30 Tamilians in this room. Maybe that will help explain certain things, compared to that there are 30 humans in this room. That may explain something else better. So different models we use have different explanatory capacities. And depending on what you are using that scientific knowledge for, you might want to use different models. But also I must tell you, science produces 100 or 1,000 times more models than is eventually used in science. That's why we produce so many papers. Why do we produce 1 million or 1 billions of paper every year? Because you try out a model I write something, I'm playing with a model, I tinker with it, I add new parameters, I write a paper, I publish it because it's okay, they publish it. But that model will never be used for anybody. Nobody will might use it. It may not match the reality at all. So the scientific knowledge is very different from which models work. In fact, something which you should know as somebody like Mr. Arnachal works on knows very well. Very large number of scientific research papers which are published in very good journals never get used even once. Not even once. So citation is one way, right? If you use it, you will cite it. Every week we are publishing huge volumes of scientific new research. There is new work, new knowledge is produced. To put some number, I may be wrong, but let's say 80% to 85%. Some people have said in some accounts I tried to see, they say about 70 plus 70. Let's say even 75%. 75% of all those papers don't even get mentioned once, which means they are not of use to anybody else in science to produce more knowledge. So models, there's a lot of scientific thinking, which is like this very fertile game. You're going on trying combinations, possibilities. Some things click, some things don't. But to think that everything science says is absolutely true is an absolutely false statement, as we can see from the publications itself.
Now, to engage the ordinary students to participate.
Yeah.
The second question.
Yeah.
Right. You have any ideas?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, take a couple of more.
எல்லாருமே ஏதாவது கேள்வி இருந்தாலும் கேட்கலாம். நல்லாவே தமிழும் தெரியும்.
தமிழ்ல வேணாலும் சொல்லலாம்.
தமிழ்லயே இந்த கேள்விகளை கேட்கலாம். தாராளமா கேட்டால் கேள்விகளை ஒட்டுமொத்தமா நம்ம இது பண்ணி சயின்டிபிக் முறைக்கு
பாராமீட்டர் வந்து
Yeah. Okay. It's connected to the margin. I'll solve it.
இப்ப வந்து நீங்க சொன்ன சயின்ஸ் இப்ப என்ன ஒர்க் போயிட்டு சார் வந்து கிராண்ட் யூனிஃபிகேஷன் தியரிக்கான சர்ச் கரண்ட்லி வந்து ரொம்ப கான்சென்ட்ரேட் ஃபியூச்சர் என்ன ஒரு பெரிய பிரேக் வந்து ரிலேட்டிவ் அதுக்கப்புறம் சேர்க்கிற முயற்சி என்ன பெருசா நடக்கும் தியரியோட இது என்ன பிசிசிஸ்டர் வந்து நினைக்கிறாங்களா இல்லையா
Yeah. Okay, great. So, 3-4.
How are these questions going? What is say, I don't know, and half paper, right? They do not critique science per se. There is questions like who knows what is point the consequences of those answers. So what it means is as soon as we ask the question who knows what, we are missing the philosophical aspect.
Okay, very good. So maybe I'll start with your question, so I can connect these before I forget all the questions.
How can we critique science? Does it critique science per se? The reason and rationality behind that science.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a very good point. So I'll start with that because it's an important question you're raising. I don't know how I might do it, But philosophy of science after that, there have been many attempts to understand nature of science and critique of science, where we do not make a distinction between science, doing of science and the ideal image of science. That itself is a model of science. That is, you produce an ideal image, just like the earth and the sun. The earth for physics is an ideal image. It's perfectly spherical, smooth, moves at a constant speed, all of that stuff, right? Without friction. If you remember, you've done physics, first thing of a pendulum is assume there is no friction, assume it is a smooth ball, assume the wire is, mathematically thick. It's an assumption. So there's an idea, just like you do the ideal world on which you do science, so too do we understand science by looking at it as an ideal. You produce an ideal picture of science. There, the argument is science is different from who does science or science institutions. And there are many critiques of it. I didn't actually pose it as a philosophical question. In the context I said there are different questions we need to ask, different perspectives, like from sociology, like from history. So sociologists and historians would ask this question: how did it get produced? Who is running it, etc. But for me, my own philosophy, I believe that strongly draws from history and sociology. I don't believe in some very abstract idea of philosophical thinking, which is removed from the world. For example, even about religion. When somebody might say, religion is causing a lot of problems in society, let's say somebody says that, then the standard answer is, no, that is just the society of religion, people. Religion is completely different. It's, it's a way of looking at the world. It's different. It's just that bad people are misusing it, etc. So we cannot make that same model, that argument, vis-a-vis science. Because science's critique of religion is also based on that. It's not about people. It's something essential about religion, right? So there are many reasons to believe that you cannot decouple the practice of science from the nature of science. For example, anything. Somebody mentioned about violence of abstraction. I may not go to that extent, but let's say abstraction does a particular process. It does something to the phenomena. First point. Different types of abstraction do different things. In our own work on caste and untouchability and stuff, much of it you can see the function of abstraction. Reason as abstraction of particular form, which can produce people in different hierarchies. And that is a function of how it does that. So it's not an innocent act. No abstraction is a cognitive act alone. A cognitive act is a social act, given its history, memory, and its social connectedness at that point. And two, there is, today, as I said, science has become far more than the ideal image of science. It is not Newton doing science, not even Einstein doing science. It's being run in laboratories which you and me cannot access. It's being run with money being funded by very dubious means from very many different organizations. If you are spending 35 to 40, today the Russian-Ukraine war, we think has got nothing to do with science. We are deceiving ourselves. It goes to the heart of what science is. Why are we producing? Why are scientists working on producing these machines? Which politician can sit and do this? You tell me that. I'm asking a larger question. What does it mean to do science? Why? Because we look at the goal of science. So one way I teach my students about discipline, to look at disciplines, is to say a discipline needs its objects it studies, its methods it uses, assumptions. And the fourth point, which I often talk about, is a goal. Scientific knowledge is deeply defined by the goal of scientific knowledge. Why am I producing that? Why am I calling that a knowledge? For science, the goal of knowledge about nature is to duplicate nature. It is to control nature. If you look at the history of science and everything, of course, if you want to look at the critical tradition, you can also look at Heidegger and the response to the questions of technology and the critical tradition with respect to the question of science. What does it do? There's a conflict between humans and nature. Humans are weak compared to in the power of nature. So you master nature in different ways. Again, just using a very simple thing, which I'm sure you can imagine how all technology comes in exploiting resources, mastering what I'm not able to do. So what knowledge is produced in the name of science is that knowledge which can allow you to do this task. Today, the greatest knowledge which is being used is not even all this physics and all that. It's biosciences, life sciences. Cloning is just one aspect of it. We have gone way beyond it, reproducing nature and life forms. So you cannot take a position, I think, this is a point about discussion and disagreement, to say that, well, that's an ideal image of what it is to do science. It has never been that way. In fact, I would go to extent to connect to the other 2 points they said about marginalization, etc. In India, the marginalized are kept out, or even the poor, or the marginalized classes, because of the way the science is understood by science institutions. I'll give you one example. Why is, even in CAT, management exam, I'm sure many of you know about the CAT exam, very difficult. Why are even all those exams where students have to do mathematics at very high speed, 100 problems in 30 minutes? Why our management program is filled with technology guys and science people? Lot of, sorry. Yeah, but that is one part of it. I said this, I am Bangalore, when I went for one of the discussions, I said, there are people who can come, who show greater sense of ethics in the way they react to people and their own understanding of what it means to engage with the transactions. Don't you have a measure to measure that? Why? Well, we have built a whole world of absolutely corrupt people in our finance industries. And all of these are very good in numbers. In fact, I would be very worried taking these guys to do MBA for me. All I'm saying is, I was studying this to my friend who was an architect. He said in his architecture entrance exam, he had to fight because they had a maths test. They're all architects, they're artists. He wants them to draw, visualize faces and diagrams. And what maths? They're not even testing some maths. It's just some stupid arithmetic problems or some kind of problems people train for. So we have used that to retain and keep people out completely. I'll give you an example. Sorry. One of my friends was a physicist in one of the universities told me, he said the best students he gets were from surrounding areas of Bangalore. Many of them rural, Kannada speakers. He says they're the best students I get for my masters. They do fantastic work on his lab. And he said, I feel so sad because they cannot do a PhD because they don't pass through the exams. Because the exams are fixed in such a way that people of certain, he is saying, he is an experimentalist. He wants the students. He says, I can't take them because the way you set the exams in the name of science gets them all out. This is a serious issue. And I think generally, and this is the one, if there's anything we have learned from science and technology studies, it's huge discipline. It is that it is not easy to separate an ideal picture of doing science and science institutions. So if you look at it that way, and you can also look at it philosophically at various levels of nature of knowledge production, different theories of knowledge, etc. And I think you can make an argument. It's not that easy. There is something else which is more at work, and one needs to look at it in a broader context. And sorry, yeah, I'll just finish this. Yeah. So when you look at, therefore, this question of marginalization of the poor student, again, India has, again, somebody like Arunachalam can correct me, but I think in general, we will accept that with all the support given to Indian science, we have not done the kind of impact on world knowledge as we should have had. We have had very good people, in a sense, competent people in our science institutions. There is a large amount of support for them. The amount of path-breaking work which has defined, people often say today is Science Day, C.V. Raman's work. We are celebrating C.V. Raman's work. C.V. Raman won a Nobel Prize in physics. If I remember right, he's the only person in India to have done work in India and got a Nobel Prize from it. Nobody else. In science. Yeah, no, I'm saying, sorry, in science, in science, because there are other people in science who have won from elsewhere, etc. And yeah, I don't want to use Nobel Prize as a thing, but if you really look at path-breaking work with so much of scientists, etc., why have we not done it? Could it be the fact that our science community has not been diverse at all? They have completely marginalized the marginalized communities. Where is the representation? Why would we think that the imagination that people have from different communities cannot produce great science? If you look at history of science, again, the reason when our science people do not look at history of science, they do not realize that democratization of science in Europe led to some of the greatest scientists in Europe. When the early British society felt that poor people, ordinary people cannot be part of aristocratic, science had to be done by aristocratic community. It was the opening up of it which led to all the great scientists who came from people who are not allowed in. Today, we have set up a system, both in context of English, that's an important part, and this pseudo-mathematics thing, which we are privileging, that has removed a large number of, very good minds. And I'm saying this not to say, oh, rural people are great minds, etc. I'm saying it because I do workshops with children in philosophy, but a lot of it is about science. It's about thinking, and they're fantastic minds. I can guarantee you 90% of them won't come anywhere near a science institution. So we have to question that keeping these people out of science is based on an assumption of a particular model of science. You open that model up, say, bring in the questions of creativity and human activity, bring in these questions of, all kinds of social process of science. I can guarantee you we'll produce good science. You kept all these people out for so many years. And I want to ask you, what is the science you have produced? So I'm not saying, I'm saying next 20, 30 years, open it out. Get all these children in. And science is what? For me, not some, not even string theory. Just the activity of exploration, activity of thinking. Like you said, asking questions, whether it's evidence, I may think evidence, you may think it's another evidence. It's okay. The fact of disagreement, fighting authority. The most important aspect of science is questioning authority. That is the aspect of science which is completely lost in our institutions today. In today's scientific institutions where we are standing for the pressure of science, you ask yourself how much of notions of authority is available for all the people in science. You go talk to scientists, young scientists, you will see. Today's science is a completely different creature. It's all because of the institutionalization of it, based on a particular model of science where you have marginalized the marginal community more and more. And I'm not even talking about these cases of, people who are pushed to suicide like Rohit Vemula and various other people that's happening in IIT, the Solanki and so on. That is just one reflection of it. The larger context is you don't even see them in the institutions. So we have to find ways to, not just science. For me, science reflects academic life. Whether I'm in social science or humanities or literature or arts or philosophy, we are thinking deeply about things. We are doing all these kinds of work. And all the disciplines has to open up. They're all completely gatekeeping at every level. And that needs very good public education. Today, education in India has completely become privatized. We now have more than 70 to 75% of colleges in higher education which are private institutions. We are now paying, many of the top private colleges are charging 10 lakhs 1 year for BA. I don't know if you have followed Ashoka, Kriya or Jindal. 10 lakhs a year for BA to read literature. And it's important, we need to pay money to read literature. What are the students, who are the students who are going, who are paying 30, 40 lakhs to get a BA degree? So these are, all of them are connected. These students have to be taken into school, and a lot of scientists are doing it. I must say, the public, the adult science movement and the people's part science movement, they are very serious. They are like, to me, they are a lot like missionaries. They go very deeply committed in their belief and they want to go and tell people about it. And it's very important that they do it because there is an important social change they can come up with that action. But it is too less. They can't get away from going back to their idea of science. Their idea of science is still very naive. They think, for me, the biggest criticism I have of them is they think ordinary people are not logical. They're all irrational and superstitious. And that somehow the scientists are going to make us all become rational superstitious. I think they have to get out of that. They have to recognize the richness of scientific practice. Yeah. Very much, yeah. So academic knowledge, all academic communities have become, but social science, because of the nature of its study, has been far more inclusive. So typical ways you'll know even about gender. You go to a science department, gender, you can rank it. You start from mathematics, theoretical physics, experimental physics, chemistry, biology. The number of women will start increasing. Biology has the largest number of women compared to all of these, and becomes smaller and smaller as you go up. Similarly, in engineering also you can do a same. Mechanical be 0. You come down to computer science, there'll be a lot of women. And similarly of other castes and so on. So, but because the subject matter, so for example, a lot more Dalit studies will be there. Within sociology, for example, you can have more of them within the community. So, but otherwise, yeah. So the belief about what is knowledge, what is scientific, what is academics, those are the questions we are interested in asking. We're not interested in changing science or critiquing anything. How do we understand? That's all.
Sorry, அவன் எட்டுமானது சைக்கிள் நான் மிதிவண்டினா என் மொழியில இருந்து சொல்லுவோம் நான் ஈஸியா மனப்பாடம் பண்ண முடியாது
Yeah, it's a very important challenge about translation. I think Ramanujam should talk about it because translation in all terms is a problem there. Etymology and related to the translation, I'm saying some words as translation in languages may have, for example, democracy like they are etymologies in the way of secularism, in the way Indian languages has a very different kinds of descriptions. It's a lot about questions of translation. There's so much of work in that. I said, there's a much longer discussion. Here is something. Sorry, 1 second. Science also. I'll just tell what science is a goal. Has a goal. Yeah.
So, and that goal is very often what you want to do.
Yeah.
Suppose that were not your goal.
Yeah.
What would the question be like?
Yeah.
I mean, really,
Yeah.
do you think just for the sake of, is there something like
Okay.
that?
Yeah. Is there?
Is
Yeah.
there something like
Yeah.
but every act of end goal into like
Yeah.
and that end is
Yeah.
what you want to know.
Sure.
So is there a fair
Yeah.
way of knowing
Yeah.
how you want to know?
Okay. Yeah. So I think there's a very important question here is that if all science has a goal of knowing, the question is this, that it has a, if as I was saying, there's a goal of knowledge in science, which influences what kind of science that you do, then is all knowledge in science influenced by such very specific goals like this, right? And what is the last part?
Suppose that were not the
And if those goals were not the case, would you be producing different system of knowledge, for example, and so on? Okay, related around that, right? So the goal, for example, when I said the larger goals, which I said is about producing knowledge so that I can control nature to protect human interests, etc. And then to duplicate nature. That's why some of our most important experiments, for example, if I can reproduce the phenomena of a rainbow, I'm actually having a better understanding of rainbow. So understanding is replaced by reproduction. If I can reproduce a rainbow, yeah, it is a better. But there are also other kinds of smaller goals which are there in science all the time. For example, almost all theoretical work in science is based on the idea of unification, where diverse phenomena can be put under one family. And that's a very important function of, like, that idea comes into theory, literary theory and other places, right? Unification, explanation, causal structures are, for example, 3 very important goals. And that goal does influence what you produce. So, for example, the debate on theory. So all of the other ancient societies or other non-science societies don't do theory very well, according to them. Theory looks very different. Mathematics in India looks very different, although they were the pioneers of mathematics till 16th, 17th century in China, India, and early Africa. But it looks very different, right? So, yeah, so definitely what your aims are influences the kind of knowledge you produce. The debate comes when you produce knowledge from different on other goals, whether that is accepted, which is legitimized within the discipline. For example, if I have the goal of social science, to me is not to study society in the way it is doing now. For me, the goal of sociology, let us say, is to produce a more harmonious society. That's my aim, not a more controlled society. Today, sociology has a lot about controlling societies. How do I control a very unruly society? My goal of social sciences is to say, the production of a harmonious society is the goal of social science. Then I can guarantee you all the work done in research for that, what you get as funding for that, will all be working towards that goal. But Historically, we have not seen knowledge in that form.
Can a microbiologist ask?
Yeah.
Can he be guided by such a?
He cannot, because they won't, within the discipline, they won't accept it. In fact, they won't even accept. It's been very difficult for them to bring qualitative measures in microbiology. Microbiology itself is a very odd thing in a study of biology. Look at chemistry. Chemistry.
Yes, the social sciences. is fine.
Yeah.
Sociology is fine.
Yeah.
But can,
Yeah. Biologists,
like, you are.
they can't do it. Yeah.
So,
They will say, like you're saying, it's about institutions, not about science. The act of science is to produce these better and better organisms, can kill better. But if politicians use it, what can I do? That was the argument for nuclear bomb too. So I would say that if you thought of a microbiologist or a chemist cannot talk about the beauty and the color of a chemical, it's never part of your chemistry. You can't write a paper on it. Because that is what the authority figures within the discipline decide what the discipline should be. And therefore, I think we need to reflect also on how disciplines are formed, who is forming it, and why these rules come in.
We'll say that papers never be
Further, yeah.
and if it's 75%.
Yeah. Yeah, good. Yeah. Very good. No, it's a very valid point. I won't call it knowledge for knowledge's sake. That impulse is very much part of science. That's why you build a very rich institutions to do this. By the way, publications are not cheap. The private companies for which, it's a very big racket about publications. I'm not getting into that. But it's not knowledge for knowledge's sake. It is production of something under certain constraints. It's not if you wrote something on how the world is like or whatever, or like string theory, things are not like strings, but they are like something else. Unless it follows the rules of the language of the discipline, it won't get published. It's not another short story I'm writing. It is a short story under those very specific constraints, tested in those very specific ways of doing it. Then you will get it published. So it's an extension of that. And also goes back to what you were saying today about where is modern science doing in that sense, whether it's string theory or not. A lot of it has changed from traditional forms of solving mathematical equations. So much of it is driven by computers and visualization techniques. So much of it today is just computers are running stuff for you. They are producing models of the nucleus and various other forces between them. Everything is happening around in a completely different digital world.
Like
No, I'm not thinking through this problem, doing it analytically and all. It's very, very different. They are big. In fact, to give an example, today most papers in science are co-authored. Earlier, only in pure science, Einstein may be no co-author, Einstein, Newton, etc. Today, there are papers which have more than 1,000 people as co-authors. And 80% of all papers in science are co-authored. Because big teams, and within a team, one person doesn't even know. It's not knowledge for knowledge's sake. They are told, you go fix this. That person, you go fix that. And then we'll write a paper together. And that person doesn't know what this person is. You don't know what it is. So I think there's a very big difference about, the practicalities of doing science, which has become, and many scientists sometimes feel bad because they want to go back to the old picture of science. But they're caught in this vicious cycle of production because it's become a very capitalist enterprise. We have to take that into account. It's impossible. Yeah.
Such as all these and the books are coming there. How do you become of the scientific institute? Increase of the scientists. Like
They will continue. They will modify, change into that.
They will analyze.
Organize. They'll that will continue with. But you are saying something last one. No.